Okay, so today I wanted to take some time to talk about raid buffs and how they are currently impacting the game. I've made videos talking about raid buffs in the past, and I talk about raid buffs pretty frequently on the bench. Probably not that frequently, but occasionally on the bench we get into a tangent talking about raid buffs. And with what we've seen during this development cycle in the PTR, I think now is probably a good time to rehash just my thoughts on raid buffs in general. So a couple of things have happened recently. First and foremost, monks are now even more mandatory in Mythic Raid in patch 11.2. Mystic Touch has been buffed from a whopping 5% to 8% damage increase, which ends up positively affecting people who play monk. And Blizzard basically states that the amount of classes that deal pure physical damage is quite a bit less than those that can deal magic damage. For this reason, we're making some targeted adjustments to Mystic Touch to better improve its overall effectiveness for physical damage dealers. So what this ends up doing is, in Raid, Monk was already mandatory. Monk is now even more mandatory in Mythic Raid, but it was already mandatory even at 5% physical damage dealt, so it didn't really matter. This didn't really move the needle on that front. For Mythic Plus, this means that if you're playing a Warrior, a Feral Druid, a Hunter, Outlaw Rogue, a bunch of these other specializations that do mostly physical damage, Havoc, Demon Hunter, that kind of stuff, that now you are going to have a higher desire to want to play with a monk because they are buffing you by 8%, which is a huge damage gain. Like, I'm pretty sure if you go and look at Warcraft logs, the difference between, I think Frost Mage is the bottom specialization. If you give them an 8%, if you give them the difference between Arcane Intellect and Mystic Touch, that brings them to like 4th or 5th place in terms of damage, because this is a huge difference, right? Arcane Intellect is like 3% damage, whereas this is now something that's 5% better. So if you move them up 5%, they're somewhere in between like Ret Paladin and Havoc Demon Hunter, which is crazy if you really think about just how much damage is gained by Mystic Touch. So this is purely good for monk players. This is honestly actively not that great for people who are playing, like I was talking about, the Feral Druid, the Warriors, the Hunters, because now there's going to kind of be this expectation whenever you're balancing the game that you're largely going to be playing with Mystic Touch. And then this makes it more difficult to balance for Mythic Plus scenarios, because how it's going to be, and you know this to be true, is the classes are going to be balanced assuming that you have optimal buffs. But it's not going to be this, a spec does 100% damage. With these buffs, all of these buffs, it does 16% damage or whatever. It does 90% of its damage, and then it does actually the normal balanced around amount if it has all of the buffs, which, for Feral Druid players and Hunters and stuff like that, they're going to end up being worse off if they're not playing with the Monk, meaning that it's more required for them to play with the Monk, particularly in 5-man content. For Raid, this was already required. I was watching Potty C a little bit this week, and I think it was Max who had a pretty good take in regards to how raid buffs function. He called out Chaos Brand and Arcane Intellect getting nerfed from 5% down to 3%, and he said that moved the needle to make them less powerful in Mythic Plus, obviously, but still be required for raid, which is Blizzard's designed goal with how they view raid buffs. I had a chance to talk to Ian at BlizzCon a couple of years ago, and I asked him very specifically like what he thought about raid buffs just as a whole, and he told me that he thought that they did a good job of creating class diversity inside of raid fights in particular. And I do understand where that sentiment comes from. I think that has a lot of problems, and I'm going to explain the problems that I have with that sentiment a little bit. But whenever he explained out that sentiment, I did understand at least where he was coming from with that kind of stuff. But this is actually the opposite direction that you would hope for things. Like if you were playing most specializations in the game, you're probably not really affected by this much, if at all. Most casters aren't affected by this. Tanks and healers aren't really affected by this because they're not really balanced like that. But if you're a pure 100% physical damage dealing DPS and you're not a monk, you are negatively impacted by this. And if you're a monk, you're positively impacted. So more people are negatively impacted or not affected at all by this than are positively affected. And most people, if this got nerfed down to 3%, monk would still be required in raid. It would be easier to balance for Mythic Plus, and it would be less problematic for having this Exodia raid buff situation that you see occasionally in Mythic Plus. Now, the Exodia raid buff situation in Mythic Plus, we'll talk about that in a second. But I'm just going to continue to move on, and I'll continue to bring back up some of these other points. We've also seen some other discussions in regards to raid buffs, particularly surrounding Death Knight and how Death Knight currently functions, because Blizzard continues to state on the record that they believe situationally good utility such as Death Grip and Anti-Magic Zone, while you can say Warlock has situationally good utility. Where they have Gateway, they have Healthstones, they have Soulstone. Healthstones and Soulstone are frankly useful on 100% of raid encounters, and unfortunately enough, Death Grip is not. Demonic Gateway is very similar to Death Grip, where if Demonic Gateway was the only utility that Warlock would have, Warlock wouldn't be in on every single fight. Warlock doesn't have any power in any of their buffs, but being able to pull a boss an additional 4, 5, 6 times on a raid night, that's a huge deal. Getting everybody summoned to where you can pull the boss a couple pulls earlier, that's a huge deal. Having health stones, that saves pulls in some aspects. And so, while it could be, while sometimes it's compared to Warlock, I actually don't think that DK utility is anywhere near where Warlock is. And so DK is currently the only class without a raid buff. So Blizzard kind of has a decision, at least in my opinion, to make here. They could go one of two ways. They could give DK a raid buff, which now everybody has raid buff, so everybody's going to have a slot in raid, and everybody's going to have some nice raid buff in Mythic Plus, and the first copy of every single class is going to be very, very valuable. That's one way that Blizzard could go with it. Alternatively, I would do what they did after Warlords of Draenor and delete raid buffs. And so, whenever I had that conversation with Ian, he talked about how he wanted there to be more class diversity with compositions that we are seeing, and he didn't like the thought of classes being class stacked to high heavens. And we saw what this was like here. Let me see. I want to move myself. I don't know. It's always going to be covering somewhere. Doesn't matter. He didn't want to see classes being stacked to high heavens, which at the surface it makes sense. But whenever you start thinking about it a little bit more, first off, classes are already stacked a lot, just kind of as is. I mean, if you look back at Gallywix this season, they played 5 monks. Like, this is double Mistweaver monk, triple Windwalker monk. We had 4 mages. Classes are already stacked as much as possible, particularly for the Race to World First. And for most normal guilds, like even normal cutting edge guilds, nobody's going to be stacking beyond 3, particularly probably like 4 of this very specific specialization, because first off, you don't have enough people that can play that specialization, that can come in off your bench. You don't have that many of that character geared, and so you kind of have to just make it work with whatever you have. And having a more diverse comp tends to be the better thing. And I mean, it's better in Mythic Plus to have a more diverse composition as well. I'm going to continue to talk towards raid. We'll talk about this and how this affects Mythic Plus in a little bit, but having a more diverse comp also helps Mythic Raid. And I think that there are some pieces of utility that are fairly solid. And, if you go ahead and remove raid buffs, here's what I would kind of see as different, right? There is specific raid utility that is always going to be good. There's a couple of classes that are going to be lacking things. So you have defensive raid utility. If you remove all raid buffs, take all of them out of the game, you Devo, Aura, Atrophic Poison, all of those raid buffs out of the game. What you have is then you have defensive value raid buffs, where you have anti-magic zone, you have rallying cry, and you have darkness from Demon Hunter, Death Knight, and Warrior. You have movement speed raid buffs from Druid, Shaman, and Evoker with Time Spiral, Stampeding Roar, and Windrush Totem. And then you have immunities. And immunities were more useful in the past, but Bubble, Turtle, Ice Block, Cloak of Shadows. I think I'm missing one. Okay, maybe not. I think there's 4 classes with an immunity, which is fine, right? And immunities were more prevalent back in the day. Now, I don't think that you should be able to stack like 12 immunities. Like, I think that Argus here, this was like, you needed a bunch of immunities to be able to actually deal with this fight. I don't think it should be like that. But I think that, if you have, Darkness is interchangeable with Anti-Magic Zone, which is interchangeable with Rallying Cry. And Windrush is interchangeable with Stampeding Roar, which is interchangeable with Time Spiral. And of course, there's going to be some situations where they're not interchangeable with one another because they're like slightly different abilities, but the immunities are roughly the same. That creates the situation where there is group-wide utility, and you have warlocks with still their health stones and their gateways and stuff like that, and you still have DKs with their grips, where it's valuable on a couple of fights a tier, but it's not going to be the best thing on any very specific fight. Hellstones and Soulstone, the first copy of Warlock might be more valuable than anything else that's on this list whenever you're hashing it out into immunities, movement speed effects, and then like defensive buffs. But the second copy of Warlock doesn't do anything because you already have Healthstones and a Soulstone anyway, so it didn't really matter. And so I think that would actually kind of be more fair. Now, there would be a couple of classes that would be lacking here, and it would be Monk and Priest. But, you could give the situational situationally pretty good utility to Monk and Priest in this capacity as well, right? Assume that you could give group-wide movement speed to a Monk. That makes sense class fantasy-wise. For Priest, I don't know, Mass Spell sometimes pretty good. Maybe you could give all Priests Barrier. And then, then you have Demon Hunter, Priest, DK, and Warrior all with like a group AoE defensive. Something like that, right? Yeah, I'm sure you guys see where I'm kind of going with this. But that creates a situation where most of those classes are interchangeable with one another. Say you have, bringing the second warrior isn't that big of a deal, even though the Race World First Comp played a second warrior, because you brought this DK that has anti-magic zone, and he just drops AMZ where the second guy pressed the rally, and it's roughly the same. And then this kind of creates the situation where Hall of Fame guilds don't have this problem, really high-end rating guilds don't have this problem, but a lot of guilds have recruitment issues because of the raid buff situation as it currently stands, where recruiting is much harder whenever you have to field one of every single class, because then you're no longer recruiting the best available player. Instead, you're recruiting the best available Demon Hunter, the best available Shaman, right? And that kind of creates that situation that's really strange. And it makes it just harder to field compositions and create raid teams that make sense. And for better or worse, you could probably kill bosses without all the raid buffs. I've seen people do it all the time. But it doesn't make it feel better whenever you see that you're missing this monk buff, or whenever you see that you're missing 8% physical damage, and you're looking at your logs and you're getting smoked by somebody else in logs, and you realize that they have monk buff and you don't have it. It doesn't make you feel better, especially whenever you're trying hard and you're fielding a composition that has all of these raid buffs. So I would go ahead and remove them and kind of continue to create this situationally pretty good utility that most classes already have, and kind of continue to deal with it that way. Now, for Mythic Plus, it's kind of the situation where you see people running, different raid buffs and making compositions that make sense. And I think in some aspects, that's good, right? Like, I think the top couple of compositions this season, there's obviously the one with Vengeance Demon Hunter, Disc Priest, Arcane Mage, Balance Druid, Unholy DK, and that's largely a magic damage heavy composition where they're getting good value out of Chaos Brand and getting good value out of Arcane Intellect. Obviously, Mark of the Wild is pretty good. Then there are physical damage compositions which play through Brewmaster Monk, and they have a warrior. They also get the Shaman buff, they get Mark of the Wild, and then they play like a good fifth specialization, whether it be like a rogue, whether it be like a hunter or something like that. There's also warrior specializations that play through Prot Warrior with Resto Shaman. They also play with like, they get the Druid buff. They'll play with like a Ret Paladin and like an Holy DK, and they're getting most of the physical damage buffs that they desire for their composition. The thing is, Mythic Plus and AoE DPS is not very well balanced, right? You're playing with an Arcane Intellect user and a Balance Druid, but you're playing with an Unholy DK who's bringing nothing to the party, right? That guy, he's bringing to the party anti-magic zone. He's a tank. He presses A-bomb limb occasionally and helps you out. He won't be pressing it anymore, but he was pressing it in the past. And the Mythic Plus compositions aren't really well balanced anyways, and so I don't think that raid buffs and how they interact with Mythic Plus really does all too much. You're kind of looking at other things for Mythic Plus as is, and it's one of the situations where you don't really stack classes in Mythic Plus anyways. Like, you can, like, if the season launched today, in theory you would play like triple BM Hunter, because BM Hunter is that broken. But throughout the history of Mythic Plus, there's only been like one time that you've ever actually seen classes stacked, and that requires you to go all the way back to BFA Season 2, where they were playing triple Rogue, right? But realistically, you actually lose a lot whenever you play a bunch of copies of one class. There's a lot of utility that's lost. There's a lot of DRs that happen. More often than not, the utility doesn't really stack up that well. And obviously, you're losing the raid buffs, but the raid buffs are a lesser part of that equation. It's more about how the classes kind of synergize with one another in that regard. And so I think that, like, if we removed raid buffs, that would actually be better for Mythic Plus, not worse for Mythic Plus, especially kind of creating these situations. I think that what Blizzard saw this season was the usefulness of a melee specific composition and a magic specific composition, and they were like, how do we recreate that again? First off, I think they just got really lucky whenever this happened. And I think that they were like, what if we just made Mystic Touch even better? That way we have viable options for a magic damage composition and a physical damage composition. Why not just put Mystic Touch back at 8% then? Or not Mystic Touch. Why not just put Chaos Brain back at 8% then? It would create this weird dynamic where only casters are allowed to play with other casters, and only physical damage dealers are allowed to play with other physical damage dealers. Except that's not true, because some specializations do 20% more damage than other specializations occasionally, and so then it's not balanced. It's just not very balanced like that. So for Mythic Plus, it's kind of like a different issue in its entirety. All this is to say, I think that Blizzard could really use some looking at how raid buffs end up affecting raid in particular. I think that removing them wouldn't end up negatively affecting Mythic Plus. This would be the exact same shit for Mythic Plus that we've always had, where you play a balanced composition for Mythic Plus, and you're probably not going to be class stacking. And for raid, I mean, if you're going to be class stacking, that's because there's one specialization or a couple specializations that were completely turbo broken. They should have been tuned better. And for raid, you're already seeing class stacking as much as you would see without the raid buffs. I mean, again, 5 monks for 4 mages. That's similar-ish to what we saw in Shadowlands and BFA anyways. In terms of stacking, I mean, all of this is like pretty heavily stacked around those marks. It's just hard to play 4 or 5 copies of a specific specialization for a multitude of reasons. And so those are kind of my thoughts just on raid buffs as a whole. Final thoughts on this: they need to buff drums as well, please, or give bloodlust to tanks, or remove it from all the other classes. I think it just feels really bad to not play with the bloodlust. Similar thing, same thing goes without Mystic Touch. If you're, say, a hunter, it would feel really bad to play without Mystic Touch as a hunter. I'm sure it feels terrible to play without bloodlust as anybody. So buff drums. And yeah, that's going to be it for me today. Hope to see you guys in the next video, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.